Hello and welcome to the third and last of this week's videos, in which we will be taking a look at Robert Kane's libertarian view. So there are many different variants of libertarian views around, and they all try to in some way solve the problem of how to present a view that pays respect to these two important criteria that we have encountered: the ability to do otherwise and some suitably strong notion of control. And they all grapple with the same sort of problem, and that is, how can an action both be undetermined by physical events, as is required by the power to do otherwise, and still in some robust sense be under the control of the agent, right? That is the problem that we distilled at the end of the last video. So all of these different views then differ with regard to how they think free actions are caused, or even whether they are caused. Libertarianism comes in very many different forms, and we won't be discussing all of these or the differences between all of these today. We will be focusing on Robert Kane's very influential view. So Robert Kane thinks that our decisions are located in our central nervous system, in our brains, right? And he thinks that decisions are indeterministic physical events, and these are causally responsible for which is the outcome of these events, namely our actions. And important here to note is that Kane thinks that the resolution of this physical indeterminism doesn't require a non-physical agent to step in, right? An agent that is something over and above the physical world. So Kane does not require dualism to be the case, and this is important, right? And the challenge now is to try to tell a plausible story, one that is scientifically plausible as well, right? Because he says that decisions are some physical events that happen in our brain, so it needs to be scientifically plausible what he thinks happens there. And the challenge now is to propose such a story, right, of how such a decision event might look like. Kane's view is interesting in in many different respects, but in this one in particular, that he pays respect to an intuition that we might have about actions that is that has its home more on the compatibilist side of the debate. And he thinks that a lot of our actions do not require the power to do otherwise in order to be free. So he thinks that a lot of actions could be free that are in some way determined by our character, by our deepest beliefs, right? By the way that we are, in a sense. And there's a famous example that's often referred to in the debate. I think the first person who made that brought that example to bear in the debate was Daniel Dennett, and that's Luther's famous saying, "Here I stand, I can do no other." So the idea is that Martin Luther was so convinced that what he was doing was right, that it was determined by his character, that he really didn't have the power to do otherwise. But the compatibilist now asks, well, why would we say that this action isn't free, even although he didn't have the power to do otherwise in this case? And we will not be discussing compatibilism much in this, or at all really in this video, but Robert Kane thinks there is something to this intuition. He says, well, a lot of our actions might be that sort of action, and why shouldn't it be free? Right? That seems very plausible. But Robert Kane says, so not every free action needs to be a struggle between two alternatives, right? But he says some of them have to be. In order to be free, some of our actions need to be the outcome of a real struggle between competing alternatives, between different alternatives. In order for it to be the case that Luther was indeed free when he said, "Here I stand, I can do no other," his character must in some way have been formed by other decisions that he made in the past, which were real struggles between different competing reasons to act. And these actions, those that are real, the outcome of real struggles within the agent, those are what he calls self-forming actions. And for those, indeterminism needs to be the case. And how exactly that's going to work is something that we'll take a look at in a second. He thinks that these self-forming actions are character-forming. Those actions, how we end up acting in these kind of scenarios, that is what makes us us. That is what forms our character. That is what forms the character of Martin Luther before he said, "Here I stand, I can do no other," and rebelled against the Catholic Church. Take as an example this case that Robert Kane discusses in the required reading for this week. And Kane discusses the case of a businesswoman, and this businesswoman is on her way to an important business meeting, maybe one the outcome of which is really important for her professional life, right? Her career might depend on making this meeting in time, but while she's on her way, she sees a person being assaulted, and now she is in this struggle whether she should help the person being assaulted or whether she should make it to the business meeting in time. And importantly, she has good reasons to act either way, right? She has good reasons to help the victim, and she's also good reasons to make it to the business meeting in time. And Kane now says in these cases, what's happening is that there are two competing efforts to act. One to help the victim, one to make it to the business meeting in time. And these two competing efforts to act are both parallelly at the same time being prepared by the brain. And these actions are incompatible with one another, right? One excludes the other, but both are being prepared by the brain at the same time. And that's what he calls parallel processing. And he says the indeterminism that we need for the self-forming action, this is built into this parallel processing. He says that which one of those two efforts in the end succeeds is not determined by the prior state of the brain, right? That is not determined by what the brain, or indeed even the state of the universe and the laws of nature, what they look like before this parallel processing started. So there is a real physical indeterminacy built into this parallel processing. And he thinks that both of these processes that are being parallelly prepared are obstacles to the other's success, right? If the one succeeds, the other one can't succeed, and vice versa. They in a way inhibit one another. And he thinks that the businesswoman has good reasons for both of these actions, and both of these actions are being neurally prepared. They compete, right? And he thinks that at the end of this preparation of these actions, one in which she helps the agent, and one the victim of assault, and one in which she makes it to the business meeting in time, they in a sense reach an equilibrium. This parallel processing where the brain prepares both of these actions reaches a point where there's an impasse, where both are equally strong, and not one of them on their own can win over and make the agent do either option. And he thinks the only way to break this equilibrium is by an indeterministic chance event, some random physical event happening in the brain that breaks this equilibrium and makes one of those competing efforts win in the end. And where do people always look for when they look for random physical chance events? Well, they look into quantum mechanics, right? Because that's one of the areas in which we might actually have indeterminacy in physics. But there's a problem here. And the problem is that quantum events are usually microphysical events. They're very, very small events, right? At least the ones that we know of. So the classical quantum event that we know of is, for example, the decay of one radioactive atom, or where exactly one photon ends up on a screen after we fire it through a very narrow opening. That sort of thing, right? Really small scale events on a microphysical level. But the problem is decisions, or this parallel processing that he describes, those are much larger scale processes, right? There are complex neural events in our brain. There's huge clusters of neurons firing. That is it's a much larger scale than on the atomic or subatomic level, right? So in a sense, these quantum events, or that quantum event that is supposed to break this equilibrium, needs to be amplified. It needs to have, in some way, an effect on this much larger scale process, which is the parallel processing. And he thinks one way in which that can work is that this decision-making is indeed a chaotic system. So what's a chaotic system? You've probably all heard of chaos theory with this a simple example of, just imagine our weather would be a chaotic system that if that is the case, then maybe one small change, for example, the flapping of a butterfly's wings, might have really large scale physical causes, like physical effects, like a hurricane on the other side of the earth, for example. So what's a chaotic system? A chaotic system is a physical system, the outcome of which, or the state of which, might depend on very small scale events. So very small scale events can have very radical and dramatic outcomes on a much larger scale. And he thinks that decision making is such an chaotic system. So let's believe this for a second, right? As I will say at the end, there isn't that much physical evidence that our decision-making process actually works that way. But let's believe it for a second. So the story is now that there are these competing efforts. They reach the state of equilibrium, and then there's this random small physical chance event that has this much larger scale effect, because decision-making is this chaotic system, and it breaks this equilibrium. So when then in the end one of these competing processes wins, that is when we reach a decision. So that is what these will-setting or character-forming, self-forming actions look like, right? We have these competing efforts, they reach a state of equilibrium, that state of equilibrium is broken by this random chance event that gets amplified, so it has this dramatic effect on this much larger scale system, which is our decision-making event, and that is how we form decisions in these difficult cases where we have two competing efforts. So remember, let's believe all of this for a second, but remember the challenge from the argument of luck in the last video, right? The challenge from the argument of luck in the last video was, well, if it is a matter of chance, what event ends up happening, what action I end up performing, am I really in control of my actions? And Kane says yes, right? And the reason for that is he says that both of these possible outcomes that are parallelly processed by the brain, parallelly prepared by the brain, both of these outcomes are motivated by beliefs that I have. I have good reasons, for example, in the businesswoman case, to either help the victim of assault or either make it to the meeting in time. So he says the reasons for which you act are your own, right? Even if it takes this chance event to break the equilibrium, you end up endorsing your actions. You perform on actions for reasons that you had before the decision was made. And he says, in some sense, we should think differently about this indeterministic event. He says that indeterministic event is something that needs to be overcome in order for one of these options to prevail. And in that sense, he says that the indeterminism was not a cause acting on its own. It's not like we do what we do because there is this random physical chance event, but this random physical event needs to be overcome in order to do what we end up doing. So he then goes on to define a notion of control that is compatible with all of this. So he says agents need to have plural voluntary control in order to be free. What is plural voluntary control? I'm just going to read it out here. Agents have plural voluntary control over a set of options when they are able to bring about whichever of the options they will, when they will to do so, for the reasons they will to do so, on purpose, rather than accidentally or by mistake, without being coerced or compelled in doing or willing to do so, or otherwise controlled in doing or willing to do so by any other agents or mechanisms. And he thinks that is fulfilled in this case, right? I do, in the end, what I wanted to do all along. I had always good reasons to do to perform this particular action that ended up winning in this parallel processing case, right? So it is on purpose. It's not by accident. It's not by mistake. I want to do this. I want to do it when I do it, and so forth, right? So he thinks all of these criteria are fulfilled, even although there's this chance event in the that breaks this equilibrium. There are two. So Keynes' view is quite controversial, although it's a very influential view, and we could maybe boil down much of the criticism to 2 points. So there's 2 main criticism of Keynes' view, and the first one pertains exactly to the last thing that we discussed, his notion of control. You might want to ask, is this really the kind of control that we want? Right? Yes, we might have good reasons for both of these actions, so we end up doing what we want for reasons that we had all along, but still, which action I choose, what I end up doing over the other option, why I choose that one rather than the other one, that is still down to this random physical event. That is still down to chance. It's still a matter of luck. It's still a matter of luck why I end up doing A instead of Y. Or instead of B, sorry. Although I had good reasons for both A and B, right? In that sense, yes, the reasons for doing A and the reasons for doing B were my own, but why I ended up doing A instead of B, that is still a matter of luck. And is that not enough to undermine control? Right? That is a very common response to Keynes' view here. And the other response to Keynes' view is that all of this physical story the entire physical story that he tells us here is quite speculative, right? We need, decision making actually needs to be that way that Keynes proposes in order for his proposition to work, in order for his proposal to work, right? There really needs to be this parallel processing of 2 alternative efforts to act, and then they really have to reach this sort of equilibrium that has to be chaotic state, whose state can be radically altered by small scale input of this, and there actually has to be this random physical event that then breaks the equilibrium in one way, and so forth, right? He tells us a very elaborate neuroscientific story of what decisions look like, and as yet there isn't that much evidence for this, right? And you might say, why does he propose such a view then? And his response to that is usually that he says, well, isn't it better to tell a philosophical story or propose a philosophical view that is at least testable with empirical evidence, rather than to just propose one that is completely removed from the empirical sciences? So those are the 2 main criticisms against Keynes' view. Like I said in the beginning, there are very many different libertarian views, and all of those have their own strengths and their own weaknesses, and we won't be going into all of them, but we just took this one as an example. But if you're not convinced by this, then maybe you might want to learn more about compatibilist views, and that's exactly what we're going to do next week. We're going to learn about classical compatibilism, and that is the view that freedom is compatible with determinism. So naturally, they probably needed either no or different interpretation of the power to do otherwise. After we've taken a look at these views, we will also be taking a look at a very famous experiment, the so-called Libet experiment, that has been taken to show that we're not free, and we'll be taking a look at the debate surrounding that argument. So I hope to be seeing you all in the live video, in the live lecture slot, and then next week when we'll be discussing compatibilism and the Libet experiments.